about identity and difference. I also really want to complicate what we're talking about when we talk about stereotypes, because I've seen at least 4 different definitions over the discussion board, and I don't really feel like we're all having the same conversation yet. So, on the one hand, we think about race in terms of these 3 kind of broad categories. On the one hand, the demographic, because even though race is just a result of phenotype, we give it so much demographic meaning. So if we're talking about demographics, we're talking about very careful surveys of common trends and common issues that saturate an entire community or population, right? Demographics referring to demography, referring to the study of the people. However, sometimes we get sloppy and go for the empirical. For example, the model minority myth that I had us all discuss in week 1. How large is your sample size when you're making these generalized statements about, for example, Asian Americans being good at math, or Asian Americans having oppressive parents? And the same applies for talking about Latinos, because we also ended up talking about the stereotype of Latino criminality, right? And we can see how the reason why we study these together through comparison is because we see how the model minority is judged as good as opposed to the criminal. But then we can also see how, in this way, there's a hierarchy that gets constructed along these produced images. So produced images we can understand as the historical untruths that constitute stereotypes. So many times stereotypes are completely wrong, but then sometimes we end up in complicated spaces where stereotypes come about as a result of demographic realities. This is not to say that the study of stereotypes is not important, because what I want to point out is that somewhere there's a value judgment that takes place in which these images become epistemological and ontological. All right, epistemological and ontological. When we're talking about epistemology, we're referring to ways of knowing. And so when we're talking about epistemology in this way, we're talking about hegemonic epistemologies, hegemonic ways of knowing. When we're talking about ontology, we're talking about ways of being. So we can see how epistemology and ontology are related, but keep in mind, epistemology is ways of knowing, what is it? And ontology, ways of being, what does it do? So when a value judgment is made based on demographic, empirical, or produced images, and it becomes transformed into epistemological and ontological assumptions, and that's where the problem of stereotypes comes in. Because, for example, the stereotype of Latino and Black criminality is an epistemological untruth. It becomes generalized to the entire population. It also becomes ontological when particular bodies become associated with this meaning, when it becomes assumed that people from African American, African, and Latino communities are somehow criminals. You can see how there's this distinct value judgment being made. So I want us to be very careful about the use of the term stereotype. What specifically are we referring to? So for example, in talking about the representation of Black characters in Secret Asian Man, we're here talking about produced images that dip into this historical archive of constructed racial difference, right? Because what we want to aim for are differences that just are, not differences that come with value judgments that become generalized as epistemological and ontological conditions. Or for example, in talking about the model minority myth, what I want to draw our attention to are the mythical dimensions of these large generalized statements. Because there's no shame in being an Asian American who's an engineer or having parents who are doctors. You know, those are empirical things that, you know, if we did a very intensive study, which no one does because we oftentimes rely on myth making, if we did a really intensive study, we then could think about the post-1965 white-collar immigration that comes out of the Asian continent. But that's one thing, because then along the way a value judgment is made, and it epistemologically and ontologically becomes a generalized statement, which then serves hegemony. Because, for example, no one in discussing the model minority myth has brought up that 50% of the Asian Pacific American population lives below the poverty line. Instead, we're only focusing on this 50% above the poverty line. And if we're talking about racial groups, the Asian Pacific Americans are second only to white Americans. However, by losing sight of these other differences, for example, class, we then do service to hegemony by reifying the epistemological dimensions of this is who Asian Americans are, and ontologically this is what Asian Americans do. So we see here how race becomes generalized into a condition and a way of being in ways that don't reflect the realities of the community, which then serves hegemony by flattening out all differences. And this is why intersectionality is critically important, not just analytically, but also in terms of thinking about social justice. This is also an issue that occurred in the discussion about print ads. It's not subjective to have problems with produced images, because we can see here how these produced images then become generalized as ontological statuses, right? The super sexy J-Lo image becomes generalized towards the entire meaning of Latina identity within hegemony. So our critical work is to trace what value judgment is being made such that a produced image becomes understood as a reality. So, and we also need to pay attention to the fact that there are these demographic and empirical realities out here. It's not as though meaning doesn't exist. It's that meaning gets abused through being transformed into stereotypical images that become generalized towards the actual realities of people. So this also refers to Hiram Perez's How to Rehabilitate a Mulatto, because we're looking at how these histories of constructed difference with the value judgment as being negative still remain. So keep in mind that this article was written before the Tiger Woods affair scandal that completely changed his image. This is back in the day where multiple communities were trying to claim him because he was famous, and instead he was trying to work towards a healthy multiracial identity. So Perez is really critical about how the multiracial movement and how multiracial identity gets used. So here then we're returning back to beautiful identities and thinking on the one hand about the construction of identity. But then we're also thinking about how this identity gets appropriated for different political uses. And as Perez draws our attention to, oftentimes these political uses are in many ways trying to stage an organized forgetting of our racial past. So the point is not to hate multiracial people and not to hate multiracial identity, but to pay attention how this identity gets used in politics. So what I want to draw our attention to through these more theoretical readings on television is to break down the categories and images that we're given, but also to acknowledge our own complicity in perpetuating them, right? So as you're making broad statements about who Asian Pacific Americans and who US Latinas and Latinos are, I want us to be really critical about, are we talking about the demographic realities of communities and real people, or are we then just participating in producing images that become generalized as ontological and epistemological untruths? So let's be really careful about the ways in which we're reading these texts and engaging with these texts. Because inevitably this leads back to Noriega's point, right? That we only perceive either beauty or purpose. If we're talking about purpose, that relationship between capital and politics, in relation to these generalized understandings based on produced images, we can see here that the politics are really regressive in working towards the mutual understanding that constitutes a healthy balance of identity and difference. Okay? So, as we move into week 4, we'll talk more about those complicated spaces where Asian Pacific Americans and US Latinas and Latinos pick up stereotypes and work towards capital, right? Making money off of these types of understandings and images. But I want to stress again, think about not just identity and not just difference, but identity and difference together, right? So this is it for week 3. Looking forward to all the things you have to write, and I'll see you later.